10, now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. What kind of deal is this? Move away from my family, live out of a tent, and then a famine. But Abram wasn't doing any of this out of convenience or in hopes of a better life. He was doing it out of obedience. The land meant nothing to him in the long run. It was the promise. The people on earth will be blessed through you, and with this blessing comes a promised land. And the only way this was going to happen for Abram was to remain obedient to God. Let's read on in verse 10 in Hebrews chapter 11. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. He was looking forward to a different kind of city with a different architect and builder. He saw through the promise of land as being something greater than one ever could imagine. Abram was able to leave his family, friends, and stable household for a tent, a bunch of strangers, and famine because he understood that the only thing on earth that is temporary, or everything on earth is just temporary. And nothing can compare to God's promises. Abram was willing to obey God at any expense, and the best way that he could show that was that he trusted God, got rid of everything, left it behind, and fully relied on God's providence. Now think about it, if you will, the land that Abram was called out of. Let's think about where he was living when he received the call, when he was moving. Him and his father was moving him out of Ur. And in this area where he grew up as a kid, if you were to walk down the streets that he walked down as a little boy, what would you see? Maybe you'd walk into town and you'd see a ziggurat, one of these big old temples that had a little place on top for you to sacrifice things, and it might be dedicated to the moon god. Or maybe you might see people going to be with the temple prostitutes. Or maybe a friend's missing from work because of some human sacrifice. He lived in a land of sin. There was no real moral code there, only what the people thought pleased the false gods they were worshiping. Abram was called to leave this land of sin and debauchery to go to a place unknown to him. And God calls people to leave their land of sin. And by doing this, we might have to leave behind friends, family, and all things familiar. We aren't expected to know where we are going. We are only to know it is God who is bringing us there. But we don't really, all of us, we don't all just pick up and leave. Can you imagine if everybody that was called by God just picked up and left? It would just be like we were just rearranging everything. You'd be going somewhere, I'd be going somewhere, everybody would be going in a different direction. God doesn't expect us to do this, but what He does expect us to do is to see the land that we dwell in a different manner. We need to act like that we are living in tents in the promised land. She didn't like this the first time I told it to her either. Live like we know where we are dwelling is only temporal. We can present our lives, ourselves, as an altar erected to honor God where He has us. That is the only thing that Abram built that was the only thing that he built that was built to last, was an altar to God when God called him to go. This is the only thing that God asks us to build that is permanent in this land that we live in. The only thing that is going to last is a faith in Him. Now, no, I'm not saying that we should stop building homes. And I'm not saying you should tear down the homes that you've already built. But we need to understand that these things are temporary, like a tent pitched in the wilderness. They can be taken away at any time, and they will be taken away in the end. So when we leave the land of sin, we are called to the land of obedience where we can build our faith in God. And if we do this, we can be assured of the hope that Abram had. To enter a land whose architect and builder was God. This is the kingdom of heaven. Now, wait a minute. Didn't God create the world that we're living in right now? This is a trick question, because I know if I say, didn't God create the world that we're living in right now, everybody's going to be like, yes. I'm going to say no. No, He didn't. The earth God created was all very good. If you read in Genesis 1:31, when He was done on the sixth day, it was all very good. But that's not the world that we live in right now. This place looks nothing like the land God created. It's all very bad, and this is the land that we live in. The good thing is God is calling us out of this land to dwell in the land where there will be no sin, no death, no decay. God created earth for us to have dominion over, but the gift of land lies elsewhere. The promised land is indestructible. George William Curtis wrote, "A man's country is not a certain area of land, of mountains, rivers, and woods, but it is a principle, and patriotism is loyalty to that principle." Our principle is our faith in God, and our patriotism is shown through our faith in God. That's where our patriotism lies. It's not in a land that we live in, but it's in a principle that we live by. When we think about being called out of our land of sin, we don't even need to leave our homes. When God calls you out of the land of sin, He doesn't say you need to pack up and leave. You don't need to move out of the country. You don't need to move out of the state. You don't even need to move down the street. You don't even need to leave your home. We can be called out of a lifestyle of sin. And it may be that that lifestyle of sin is connected with a certain part of town or connected with a certain neighborhood. There are areas in large cities that are abundant in sinful lifestyles. And in this land is where God is calling you away from. We have places like that here in Grayson. There are places that you can go to and participate in the same types of sinful activities that you can participate in big cities. So when God is calling you out of your land of sin, He might be asking you to leave that lifestyle. Leave those friends. Or leave that family. And this is what we need to pass on to those that are living in that land of sin. And then He's asking you to leave all these to go to an unfamiliar place. And to some people, that unfamiliar place, that unfamiliar land, is church. But the church is not the promised land, even though some of us may think it is. It is the doorstep to the promised land. It is the first step to obedience, the first step to faith. Don't get me wrong, it's nice to have a church. You know, we don't want to be sitting out in the cold on a day like today worshiping, though we would do it. But it's nice to have a building. It's nice to have land in the back for the kids to run around and play on, but it's not the promise. If it were the promise, if the church were the promised land, it's not evenly distributed. You think about some of the mega churches, what they have, you know, and you think if it was supposed to be the promised land, it would be evenly distributed. We'd all have the same share. We'd all have the same house of worship. We'd all have the same amount of land. We'd all have the same features, but the two are not the same. Being called to a church might be like being called to a land of strangers. For some, I know the first time I came here, I felt like I was in a land of strangers. I don't anymore, thankfully. But when you go to a church, when you go to a new church, it's like being called to a land of strangers. It's being called to a different lifestyle, something that you're not used to, and you need to get rid of those old companions of yours to be able to enjoy this new land that God is calling to you. And unfortunately, some choose to go back to that familiar land that they're from. They choose to go back to the land of sin because they think that this is it. They think, okay, this is the promised land. They think that this is where they were called to, the church. Once again, we're going to say that it is nice that I'm not going to say don't want to come to church. We all want to come to church because we like the fellowship with those who have also been called out of that land. But what we need to tell them is that there's a greater land that God has promised us where we will dwell with Him. God called Abraham to a promised land. He struggled. He had to have struggled at least for a second. Somewhere in his family, the hard goodbyes. It doesn't say that he doubted, but it still wasn't easy to say goodbye to his family. We have people today that are going to be called out of a sinful lifestyle. If you've seen the TV show Intervention, the people on this TV show are caught up in some kind of addiction and are called out of that lifestyle back to people who love them, but they have to let go of that. They have to let go of what they know, let go of that sinful lifestyle. Maybe they have to stop frequenting certain clubs or certain areas, but they're called out of that. When we are called out of that, God expects us to go. But then when we get there, He doesn't expect us to say, well, this is it. And when we show up to church, we can't just say, well, this is it, because that's where brings about stagnation. You know, you have Christians who become Christians and they say, well, this is it, there's nothing more required of me, and I'm cruise control. You know, they're building a house based on that instead of having a tent and saying, God, do with me what you will. Becoming stagnant in your faith is not what God expects out of us. He wants us to be able to be on the move at all times for Him, but He also wants us to know that our hope lies in a greater promised land. Abraham did that at the time he was able. But he obeyed. He moved. He went to a land where he wasn't going to know anybody, where he was to live like a stranger, but his hope remained in the fact that there was a better promise out there waiting for him. And there's a better promise out there waiting for us. There's a promised land that we can't even imagine. This is nice, but this for us is just like a tent. We shouldn't hold on to it. We should be ready to move. When times get tough, God moves us somewhere else. This is just temporary. We should treat this like a tent and expect to have a greater gift, a greater promised land. If you think back to the Alvin and the Chipmunks saying, well, what's that worth? What's that worth? But over a few years, that's going to gain worth. It's going to be worth more when you cash it in. Right now, this may not seem like it's worth much. But when we cash this in, the prize is going to be so much better than a $20 savings bond, I'll tell you that. And then that lady that couldn't understand what the worth was of that 10,000-acre cow farm. You know, there's not much worth to that. The real worth is where we have our promise from God, that gift of land, that gift of eternity with Him in heaven. Let us pray.